Hey Anamstaters. So today I posted a thing on our Discord showing exactly how I solved a difficult situation at work through use of locators, constraints, and a whole bunch of fun stuff. But unfortunately I kind of left a few of you in the dust with my long explanation and with some of the terminology and things like that. So I thought I would go ahead and release a video that gave you a visual kind of step-by-step process about how I went about solving it. For this explanation, it's going to kind of assume that you already know what are locators, parenting, constraints, and things like that. If you don't know what those are specifically, Google it. I mean, there's already dozens of videos on it already. You don't really need my explanation about it. So if you don't know what they are, go ahead and pause this video, deal with that, and then come back to it. But until then, we're going to go ahead and step forward. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using Maya 2013. It really doesn't matter what version of Maya you use, so long as it's anything past 2012. I think all the features are going to be pretty much the same from version to version. And we're not going to be doing anything too mind-bending here, so it shouldn't be that difficult to follow along. I've already went ahead and created a mock-up scene for our situation. Something very similar to what I had at work without actually, breaking my NDA and all that. But we're going to take it step by step. We're going to break it up into 3 individual parts, similar to what I did in the image, and I'm going to go and break it down piece by piece to make sure that everyone understands what's going to happen here. Part 1 is going to be pretty straightforward. The first part is just going to be creating a contact point on the character's neck, so we have something to kind of grab onto and pivot off of. For this, it's going to be really straightforward. The only thing we need here is a point on poly constraint, a group, and a locator. Now, a lot of you may not know what point on poly constraints are. This is kind of a more recent addition to Maya. I mean, by recent I mean like the last 8 years. But a point on poly constraint allows you to take any face on a mesh, let's just say, I don't know, this one, and then allows you to grab an object and then constrain that object directly onto the face. And the great thing about point on poly constraints is it uses those 4 vertices and the normal to kind of constantly point your object in the same direction. So even if your mesh is deforming and things like that, the object will constantly rotate and shift to kind of stay in between those 4 vertices. So for this example, normally I would put a locator here, but locators can get kind of like cumbersome if you have like a whole bunch in the same area. So instead, I'm going to create an empty group node by pressing Ctrl G. And see right there, just this little tiny group. And a group is just a translate node without a shape node associated with it. But to constrain to the neck, I'm going to grab this mesh here, grab any polygon, I think we said this one before, and then I'm going to control select that empty group in the outliner, go to constrain, I'll go all the way down to point on poly, and I think the default settings are going to work just fine. But now you can see the group has a new constraint underneath it, and it's not your typical constraint. It actually treats it as a node instead of an actual constraint, which I'm not too familiar with the details on that, but it works great. But you can see if I click on my null now, it is completely constrained to the neck, and if I don't have any animation on this, but if I moved it around, it would completely follow along. So that's the first locator on my demo. The second locator is going to be, I'm just going to go ahead and create a locator here, and then make this child of the empty group. And then after that, I'm going to take this locator, zero out all the values. So now the locator is sitting exactly on top of that group. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, if we already have the contact point from the group, why do we need a null or a locator? Well, the whole point behind this is a lot of times when you're setting up contact points, you don't know exactly where you're going to be touching an object or a person or a thing, yada yada yada. So a lot of times it's nice to have a locator just underneath an empty group or underneath another locator. So throughout the animation, we can be like, okay, well, you know what, this isn't quite what I'm looking for. I want to shift it over, maybe drop it down a bit, set a key there, and then later on in the animation, if you're going through some extreme changes, you can set a key and then kind of move this around to something different. So it's kind of a backup plan just in case your initial assumption of where the contact point should be doesn't quite work out. And that is pretty much it. That is the entire contact point for the neck. It's just an empty group, a point on poly constraint, and an empty locator. For part 2, we're going to be creating what's called an auxiliary pivot. Now I know I lost a few of you when I said auxiliary pivot before because it's a term actually native to Motion Builder. But it's a complex term to kind of say it's an extension of an existing IK system. Otherwise known as, we're going to change the pivot point of our IK control. So right now, if we click this, our little IK control, its pivot is right at the wrist. Now if you're grabbing onto something or touching something or interacting with anything in any way, this is not the ideal pivot point for, dealing with objects. Ideally, if we're going to choke this person out, we want to be able to have the contact point be right here so we can pivot freely. The advantage of having an auxiliary pivot versus just directly constraining the hand to the neck is we will slowly be able to kind of manipulate that hand still. So the translation will stay in place, but we can still have freedom to rotate and make things so it doesn't look so arcade and static. It is very easy to tell when something is just constrained to the neck like that. So an auxiliary pivot will just help us kind of move around it. To create an auxiliary pivot, it's actually not as difficult as you would think. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a locator. And I have a little script here that helps me kind of put a locator on a spot. So if you can't follow along with that, I'll be sure to put the locator script down below so you can put it either on a hotkey or put it on a shelf or things like that. But I created a locator. It has the same exact position and rotation as this IK effector. And I'm just going to move this locator to the point where we think we're going to make contact with the neck. And it's going to be right about there. It doesn't need to be perfect, but we want it to be at least close. Yeah, right about there. That's pretty. That's some good neck choking location right there. Alright. So the next step that I explained in my description was, has something specifically to do with motion capture. If you're doing hand key animation, you don't need to do this. But if you are using motion capture, this is really useful. What you need to do is you need to constrain the locator to your IK control. So for this, I just constrained it using a parent constraint, and you want to make sure that you maintain offset on that parent constraint. And boop, there it goes. After you do that, what you're going to want to do is bake down that locator. We want all the animation that would normally be on the IK handle, but with a slight offset to it. So when you bake it down, it should have a key on every single frame with the offset of the IK control. But we don't really need that for this example because we don't have any animation on these characters, and for hand key animation, it's not required. So, you have the locator sitting on the contact point for the hand. Next thing we're going to do is want to create a second locator on the exact same position on the IK handle. Then we're going to make this a child of the first locator. So if you look at the hierarchy, we have our locator on the outside being at the top of the hierarchy, and then the one we just created at the wrist position right below it. And the reason we did this is the exact same reason we did it for the contact point on the neck. If we kind of set up a position but then realize later on, it's like, oh crap, you know what, this isn't exactly the pivot point I want, you can select this lower locator here and then move it around. And then it will move the hand to kind of reshift your position on the pivot. So after you set your two locators, the last and final step is you just need to constrain this control to your second locator. So I'll go ahead and select these two, and I'll go ahead and use my hotkey for it to snap it there. So you can see our control now has a constraint on it. And then if I move this, boop, moves around, and then congrats. We now have a new pivot position for our IK handle. I forgot to mention this before, but we successfully created part 1, the contact on the neck, part 2, the auxiliary pivot on the hand. The last step we actually needed to do was connecting parts 1 and part 2 so we can actually stick that hand right on the neck. And that's a super easy step. All you have to do is take the contact point and then the auxiliary pivot and then just set a point constraint. And then boop, there it goes. Snaps right onto the neck. And then no matter where we move this character, the hand's gonna follow it. But with the added advantage of grabbing onto our aux pivot, and then we can still rotate it freely. So if it doesn't quite work out the way we want it, we can kind of rotate it around. If we don't like the pivot point on the neck, we can grab that locator and just kind of be like, you know, it's actually shifted over. I'm not quite comfortable with where that palm is sitting. I'm just go ahead and move it, and that's just like a nice little spot right there. So that's the advantage I was talking about before with part 1. If you have that additional layer of groups, like right here we have the group and then the locator right below it, then it allows you to kind of shift things around freely. Part 3 is going to be a little tougher to explain, especially if a lot of you haven't dealt with motion capture or had to deal with complex interactions like this. But I'm going to try to break it down step by step and see if we can really just kind of slowly progress through this. So let's talk about the problem first. So I mentioned before in my explanation that when we were setting this up and trying to, you know, do a whole bunch of keys with this hand on the neck, we were running into a lot of gimbal lock. And the reason that is because on IK effectors, if you rotate them a certain way, it kind of lines it up perfectly to just gimbal out constantly. And there's a lot of situations where this can happen. It happens all the time to me, but there are ways to go around it. And just to kind of further explain how this works, if you grab onto any control go into your tools, and for Maya 2013, the tools are in the upper right-hand corner in this middle mouse button here, or this middle button here. In later versions of Maya, I believe the tool options are actually in a separate kind of button. But in this instance, we're going to select a control, hit E for rotate, and then right up here, there's an option for clicking gimbal. Now, at first glance, you're not going to see too much of a difference, but if I grab this control and then slowly rotate it, you'll see that the x-axis kind of rotates around, and then when I let go, it stays in this position. This is actually what's happening to your controls when you rotate stuff around. If you're in world space or local space, you kind of take advantage of it because it always snaps back to that kind of those three circles, equally spaced. But when we're actually moving or rotating the control, it kind of shifts to a different position. And in certain situations, when they get way too close, you get what's called the gimbal lock. Meaning it doesn't know how to rotate the gimbals in a way that it won't just completely freak out and add like 360 degrees to it. So in FK situations, it doesn't happen that often, but IK handles have to deal with this a lot. And if I grab this right now, boom, pretty as a picture, there's our gimbal lock right there. This is why I was gimbaling out so many times. And this can be really, really, really irritating to fix, especially if it's happening every 3 frames and you have a lot of frames to deal with. So a lot of times in this situation, I'll create what's called a gimbal fix. For that is also going to require 2 locators. Gotta love locators. They fix everything. The original design I had is I originally put a locator here and a locator at the pivot point here, but we don't necessarily need to do that. If you have a kind of similar position throughout the entire animation, there's an easier way to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a locator right at the origin, right here. And I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees. Forwards or backwards, doesn't matter. And then I'm going to create a second locator at the position of my auxiliary pivot, which is this one right here. So I'm going to create a locator. It's right at that position, and I'm not going to move it. Instead, I'm going to make it a child of the one we just created at the origin. There we go. So now if we look at this hierarchy, there's the one at the origin, there's the one that's in the same exact spot as our auxiliary pivot. But now, if you look at this, if I check my gimbal, this one is gimbal locked. This one, because we offset it by 90 degrees, does not have the gimbals anywhere close to each other. See, if I rotate there, there's the offset, but because this one accommodated for the fact that we are sitting at a 90-degree angle pointed away from the ground, we can freely move this without getting a gimbal lock. And what I do in this situation right afterwards is I will trace this locator to the auxiliary pivot on put a key on every single frame, and then when you open up the graph editor, you're going to be able to see those like little pops and inconsistencies in the animation that is normally masked by like giant gimbal lock kind of like sweeps. So usually what I'll do is I'll take this locator, I'll clean up the animation on this locator, and then at the very last step, what I'll do is I'll take my auxiliary pivot and trace that back to the locator I just cleaned up. And even if it gimbals out still, it's still going to be on the exact position I want it to, and that's what we're looking for. I know that sounds a little bit complex, and it may not make sense unless you see it in kind of like a live instance, but that's how that works. So that should explain everything. We have 3 different locator systems, one for a contact point, one for an auxiliary pivot, and one to clean up our gimbal just in case things go south. So I really hope this helps, and if not, I'm in the Anim State Discord. You can ask me questions anytime. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you guys next time.